At present, there are about 7,200 living languages ranging from regional types to the dominant languages of the Indo-European or Sino-Tibetan families. This e-lecture discusses and exemplifies the main linguistic parameters with which languages can be classified. We will proceed as follows. First, we will provide an overview of the parameters with which languages can be classified. And then we will discuss each of these parameters in detail. In principle, one can choose any linguistically relevant parameter to classify languages. For example, the use of color terms, the number of vowels of a language, the numerical system a language uses, or the complexity of syllables, to name a few. However, in looking at a vast number of languages, it has turned out that there are some linguistic parameters along which languages can best be classified. For example, there is the morphological or structural parameter. Another one concerns the classification of languages in terms of its basic word order pattern. Whereas the first parameter, the morphological or structural one, classifies languages on the basis of their word structure, in particular in terms of its inflectional properties. The second uses the sequence of the basic functional elements of clause structure, that is, subject, verb and object. A third parameter can be used to classify languages on the basis of their phonological structure. Let us start with structural aspects. Languages can be morphologically classified on the basis of the inflectional structure of their words, thus in terms of a continuum. Now, this continuum is symbolized by this vertical line here. At one extreme of this continuum, we find so-called analytic or isolating languages whose words have little or no internal structure. At the other extreme, we have synthetic languages which do allow the analysis of their words into smaller parts or morphs. Let us look at these two extremes in more detail. Analytic languages, also referred to as isolating, generally do not allow the segmentation of their words. That is, the words of an analytic language cannot or hardly be split into smaller units. Thus, a typical analytic language is a language where there's a one-to-one correspondence between words and morphemes. Well-known examples of analytic languages are Chinese and Vietnamese. Synthetic languages, by contrast, do allow a segmentation of their words into morphs. Here are two examples. The first is an example from Turkish. Adam Larin, which means men in the genitive case, consists of 3 morphs. A second example has been taken from German. Menschen, humans, consists of 2 morphs. So both languages allow the segmentation of their words into morphs. In other words, they are synthetic. The degree of synthesis is different. One could argue that German is less synthetic than Turkish because there are fewer inflectional possibilities in German. Let us now look at the function of the morphs in German and Turkish in more detail. Now, in Turkish, we have a clear-cut correspondence between morphs and their grammatical function. Adam, which means man, is the stem. Lar stands for the plural and in stands for the genitive. In German, the same holds for Mensch, which is the stem. But what about the affix? Well, in Turkish, we can say the 2 bound morphs, plural and genitive, lar and in, are functionally unambiguous. But in German, by contrast, well, we have a problem. The affix can denote the plural in its nominative case, the plural in its genitive case, in the dative and in the accusative case. It can even denote the singular genitive, as in des Menschen Gesicht, the human's face. In other words, whereas in Turkish the bound morphs are functionally unambiguous, in German the bound morphs exhibit several grammatical functions. Thus, depending on the function of these morphs, we can define two types of synthetic languages. On the one hand, we can define so-called agglutinating languages, and this is the case for Turkish, whose morphs are by and large functionally unambiguous. In such a language, which is sometimes also called agglutinative, a word may consist of more than one morph, but the boundaries between the morphs are always clear-cut. Moreover, a given morph has mostly a reasonably invariant shape, so that its identification is also straightforward. Another example of an agglutinating language is Japanese, so let's move Japanese over here into a position close to Turkish. On the other hand, we have synthetic fusional languages like German, where the dependent morphs often have several grammatical functions associated with them. In fusional or inflecting or inflective languages, there are no clear-cut boundaries between the morphs. Also, several grammatical properties are often fused together to give a single unsegmentable morph. Most Indo-European languages are fusional. For example, Latin, which is fairly synthetic and fusional. Russian, which is also fairly synthetic and fusional, but perhaps less synthetic than Latin, but more synthetic than German. So these Indo-European languages are synthetic and fusional. And what about present-day English? Well, English is traditionally, or has traditionally been classified as a synthetic fusional language. But it also has a large number of indivisible, that is, analytic words, that is, conjunctions, prepositions, pronouns, etc. So English perhaps should be placed somewhere over here. It involves a high degree of analysis, but also has synthetic elements which are of course fusional rather than agglutinating. Note that it is often difficult to assign a language to the agglutinating or fusional type. Many languages have properties of both. Let us now look at the second parameter, the syntactic parameter of word order. The order of the functional constituents of clause structure, that is subject, verb and object, has been made into the second, or maybe even the first, the most important typological parameter along which languages can be classified. This provides us with 6 theoretically possible word order types. For example, languages could exhibit the SVO structure. Then languages could be organized in terms of SOV. Another possibility is to have the verb in the first position, then the subject, and then the object. Or to have the verb in the first position, then the object, and then the subject. And it's also imaginable that languages start their sentences with objects, then the subject, and then the verb. Or they have a structure where the object is followed by the verb and then the subject. In fact, all 6 theoretically possible types are used in the languages of the world. However, the distribution of these types across the languages of the world is relatively remarkable, because we find that these orders here, the first 3, cover the vast majority of the languages of the world, and that the other types, these 3, are very much marginal. Well, what do the first 3 have in common? Well, they have in common that the subject always precedes the object. Let us illustrate this with some languages. For example, English is a typical SVO language. Turkish is an example of an SOV language. And Arabic is an example of a VSO language. So these are the three main types, and in fact the vast majority of the languages of the world use any of these three types of word order. The main question arises now, how do we establish the basic word order of a language? Well, let us illustrate this with present-day English. In present-day English, declarative sentences, and these are the sentence types we are going to explore, the following word order types can be found, or not. We all know that English has many examples where we have the subject indicated in red, then the verb, blue, and the object represented in green. The man saw the woman. No problems with that word order. SOV, by contrast, is impossible in present-day English. So the man the woman saw is absolutely impossible. There's no sentence in present-day English which can exhibit the SOV structure. Now, VSO is an interesting type of word order which is possible in present-day English. However, as you can see in the example, never has the man seen the woman. There must be an adverbial preceding. The adverbial, of course, is never. And then we have a VSO word order. However, the adverbial has to be of a negative kind. By no means has the man seen the woman is possible, but always has the man seen the woman does not work. So this is possible but exceptional. Verb, object, subject is certainly impossible. Never has the woman seen the man. Well, superficially it looks as if the first sentence, never has the woman seen the man, is possible. However, please note that the woman is the object and the man the subject. We can illustrate the impossibility of the sentence by replacing them with pronouns, and then you have never has her seen he, and that's of course totally out. OSV, the next word order, the woman the man saw, is impossible. However, quite interestingly, it works in cases of object fronting under certain thematic pressure. The woman he saw, or I always remember the famous Metallica line, "Trust I seek," from Nothing Else Matters. The old rock musician comes through. So this works, however, in very rare cases. In fact, the condition is that the subject, he, must be nominative marked. So for example, we have I, he, she, we, and they. And finally, OVS, the woman saw the man. Again, this looks superficially as if it was possible. The woman saw the man. However, please note the woman indicated in green is the object, the man the subject. If we draw a parallel with pronouns, then you can easily see that her saw he is impossible. So what can we conclude from this? Well, we can conclude that in present-day English declarative sentences, the overwhelming majority of sentences exhibits the SVO word order. Thus, present-day English is an SVO language. And this can easily be supported by the analysis of English text corpora. Over and above the basic word order, there are interesting correlations, that is, ordering patterns that concern other head modifier relationships, and there may be problems. However, these will be discussed in a separate e-lecture on word order typology. Let's finally look at the phonological parameters of language classification. Well, there are several possibilities of classifying languages phonologically. For example, one could use segmental aspects such as the presence or absence of certain segments or segmental effects. Examples could be the pre-absence, presence or absence of particular vowels or consonants, or the use of nasalization. However, such segmental parameters are less significant than suprasegmental aspects, such as the classification of tonal phenomena or the rhythmic organization of a language. So let's look at them in more detail. Now, pitch variations that affect the meaning of a word are called tones. A language that uses this technique is referred to as a tone language. Well, let's illustrate this on the map. The simplest kind of tone language uses two possible tones, that is, high tones and low tones. Such languages are called registered tone languages, and they can be found primarily in Africa, for example within the Bantu languages. More complex tone systems use contour tones, tones that involve gliding movements, for example rising tones, falling tones, fall rise, or rise fall. The most well-known contour tone languages can be found in Asia, for example in the Sino-Tibetan languages or in the Austroasiatic languages. Let us listen to some Chinese tones to illustrate this effect. Now here are the numbers 1 to 10 in Chinese, taken from a dialect spoken in Wuhan. Let's listen to the tones.
1
Clearly a level tone,
2
rising,
3
level,
4
rising,
5
falling,
6
level,
7
level,
8
level,
9
falling,
10
and level again. So this should suffice to illustrate the tones in Chinese. The second phonological parameter which is often applied is a rhythmic parameter. Now, according to the rhythmic organization of speech, languages can be subdivided into two types: stress-timed and syllable-timed. A language is defined as stress-timed when it shows, at a given rate of speech, a rhythmic patterning where tone units are roughly perceived as equal in length. English is such a case. Now here you have a sentence represented phonologically with syllable boundaries. Many intelligent students go to Marburg, and the line I've just inserted indicates that we have two tone units with one nucleus each: stew and ma. Many intelligent students go to Marburg. Both tone units with one nucleus are roughly perceived as equal in length. Thus, English is a typical stress-timed language. This can be contrasted with Italian. Now, the direct translation of this sentence into Italian is: molti studenti intelligenti vanno a Marburg. And if you listen carefully, you will find that here we have a tendency for every syllable to be heard as lasting approximately the same amount of time. So Italian is syllable-timed. Let us summarize. We have defined several parameters for the classification of languages. Morphologically, languages can be classified in terms of a continuum between analytic and synthetic. Syntactically, the basic word order, that is, the order of the main functional elements in declarative sentences, constitutes the central parameter. In phonology, segmental as well as suprasegmental features, and here in particular tonal and rhythmical aspects, constitute the basis for a typological classification of the languages of the world. In addition to these central parameters, numerous specific parameters ranging from phonology to syntax and even beyond come in. But that's a different story.
All living languages undergo constant changes in which all aspects of language structure are affected, from changes in phonology to changes in the vocabulary.
The discussion of all of these would be too much, however, so we have to confine ourselves in this e-lecture to the first two, namely phonology and morphology, and we'll discuss and postpone other changes, syntax and vocabulary, to another e-lecture. So let's start with phonological change. Now, in comparative philology, the earliest days of, or the predecessor of linguistics, people like Jacob Grimm discovered that cognates, that is, related words across the languages of the world, are similar somehow. For example, in Sanskrit, one of the classical languages, we had a word for father, which is piter. The same word, father, in Greek, in classical Greek, was pater. And in Latin, a language which some of you might speak or have learned at school, it was pater. So, in looking at these three words, we can see a large number of similarities. They all start with an initial voiceless plosive, they have an internal dental plosive, and so on and so forth. If we now compare such words with words of present-day English, for example the word father, then we see some sort of principled relationship, that the p, for example, in the classical languages corresponds to f, to a labial-dental fricative in English. Now these and other relationships were defined, as we said, by Jacob Grimm earlier on, who lived between 1785 and 1863, as the first consonantal shift.
Oh, but I thought that the Grimm brothers were famous for their collection of fairy tales and songs.
Well, Jacob Grimm was also a comparative philologist, and he discovered these sound correspondences, which were later named after him as Grimm's law. Now today we know that there are numerous processes that affect sound change. Let us illustrate some of them in more detail. So shall we look at assimilation first?
Yes, assimilation is defined as a sound change where one phoneme is influenced by the pronunciation of a neighboring sound. As in our example from Latin noctem, we have the k and the t, whereas in Italian notte we only have the t. So the velar plosive k changes to t in Italian, notte, under the influence of t. Hence some sort of regressive assimilation takes place.
Okay, then this must be an example of merger, where we have the two words caught and cot that merge into cart. Well, I can only simulate American English in North American English. So what about the one in the middle?
The split. The split is a phonemic change where one phoneme is split into two. The short R words of North American English can serve as an example here. Before voiceless, fricatives and nasals, they involve a long R, whereas before plosives, such as the T in our example, they remain short.
So this is then ham and hat.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, the remaining changes here, the remaining phonological changes are primarily losses and insertions. So if you lose something in the middle of a word, then you call it syncope. If you lose something at the end, you call it apocope. If you insert something in the middle of words, you label it epenthesis. The insertion of something at the beginning is called prothesis. And if two phonemes change their place, you call it metathesis.
Right. Well, if you want to learn more about phonological changes, you could either consult the VLC glossary or load the virtual session Principles of Language Change. But let us now continue with the morphological changes.
Okay, here we are.
There are numerous labels to distinguish the types or processes of morphological changes. A good deal of morphological modification appears to follow from phonological processes. For example, the weakening of the Old English case system from 5 cases to 2 cases in present-day English. It seems to have its source in the phonological reduction of syllables in polysyllabic words. Even though the structural details of morphological changes are language-specific, generalizations can be made which reflect the patterns of morphological processes. So let us now look at some processes of morphological change in detail. Let's start with paradigmatic leveling.
Okay, most paradigms in Old English did not contain the maximum number of possible differentiation. Here we have the paradigm which stands for present-day English tail. Seo talu means the tail. Now theoretically we could have 10 different forms. 5 for the singular, 5 for the plural. But really we only have 4. Singular, talu, tale, and in the plural, tala and talum. So the functional distinction between subjects and accusative objects is only possible in the singular but no longer in the plural. In other words, we can observe a leveling or a reduction of the inflectional paradigm. Let us look at analysis and synthesis next. The separation of words into individual units is the most obvious result of a morphological change towards analysis, towards a language being more analytic. A trend in this direction presupposes the occurrence of more and more additional words such as auxiliary verbs or determiners or prepositions and so on. So, for example, in Old English we had ich luvir, which stands for I will love, and which consisted of 2 words, and now in present-day English we have 3 words and additional auxiliary. In early modern English, beautifulest was a form which was used, for example, in Shakespeare's works. 1 word was now split into a periphrastic form consisting of 2 words, most beautiful. And in Latin we had amabo, which is I will love, which in vulgar Latin became amare habeo.
But we have to be careful here. The other way around is also possible. That is, from analytic to synthetic. In the Romance languages, for example, the originally synthetic future form in Latin became analytic again, as we have just seen. In Vulgar Latin we have amare habeo, 2 words, and in Italian we have 1 word again. Should we now turn our attention to the principle of analogical restructuring?
Yes, I think we should. Analogical restructuring is the most noticeable way in which morphological systems change. In this process, irregular patterns become regular in accordance with other examples of the same language. For example, in the verb system of English, we can observe this process. Several irregular verbs have become regularized in the development of English. Here we have an example from Old English, where we have the infinitive form helpan, which means to help, the past tense form halp, and the past participle holpen, and today we just have 2 forms, help and helped.
Yes, I see. The PDE forms have been remodeled by analogy, with forms such as walk, walked, or play, played, and so on and so forth. But
Exactly.
Doesn't analogical restructuring take place in PDE as well? Couldn't we say that the deletion of whom in present-day English is also an example for analogical restructuring?
I think we could. Yes. So the question whom or who could be answered by means of exactly this process. So if you look at this paradigm, we have in the neutral form we have an identity between the nominative and the subject marking and the object marking form. We have that. In the non-personal one, which, the school which I saw, for example, we have also identity between the subject marking and the object marking form. Only in the personal one we have this, well, you might call it archaic form whom, which distinguishes the nominative from the, well, the object case form. And so it is relatively reasonable to assume that whom is disappearing from the English language because of this principle of analogical restructuring. The paradigm, the personal paradigm, will be restructured by means of analogy with the others. Well, I think that's it for morphology and phonology, which should stop here and postpone the syntactic and lexical aspects of language change to another e-lecture. So this is what is going to come next.
So we will be back.
This e-lecture is a direct continuation of Types of Language Change 1, where we discuss the principles of phonological and morphological changes. So the focus in this e-lecture will be set on syntactic and lexical changes, that is, changes in the vocabulary.
So to find out about the phonological and morphological changes, we recommend you to view Types of Language Change 1.
So let's start with syntactic changes.
Right. Syntactic change is primarily associated with the change of word order. In this context, it seems reasonable to assume that general processes are at work when a language changes its basic structure. It is often referred to as syntactic reinterpretation, and in many cases, a change of word order is initiated by a process of topicalization, which is the fronting of topical elements.
I have a nice example here from rock music, Metallica, but don't get carried away.
Never opened myself this way. Life is ours, we live it our way. All these words I don't just say, and nothing else matters. Trust I seek, and I find in you. Every day for us something new. Open mind for a different view, and nothing else matters. Never care for what they do.
Oh, I could listen for ages, but we have to work on syntactic change. And here you see in the line trust I seek, we have object fronting, which is a very exceptional structure in present-day English, but it exists. And this principle of topicalization was relatively widespread in Middle English. Let us look at two examples here. The first is they slain here children, which means they killed their children. And in this sentence we have the verb in the second position, just like in the second sentence. Me dreamit that I was led to Durham. I dreamed that I was led to the city of Durham. So the verb is second. And the subject is in the first position. Well, in the first sentence it is simply a subject mark pronoun, but in the second, well, it is not the subject, it is the topic. But we have to interpret this as the subject, and so this is what we're doing. We take the first element, the subject, even though in sentence number 2 it is not the true subject.
I see. To bring the word order of constructions such as example 2 into line with the majority of the other sentences, the topic in such constructions is fronted. Me became I, so the result was I dreamed that.
Okay, just like in these constructions, here we have two further Middle English constructions where the subject is me. Well, it is not really the subject, it's a topic, but it was reinterpreted as the subject in present-day English, where me thristed sare, which means literally me thirsted very, which came out as I am thirsty, and me likede peran, me liked pears, became I like pears. Well, this process is empirically quite well supported, and it looks as if syntactic changes start in in a relatively limited domain and then extend to more general patterns of the language. So I think we could generalize the situation and incorporate some further data, namely from our mother tongue, German.
Right. According to the German linguist Theo Vennemann, who was born in 1937, languages that are in the process of changing their basic word order are referred to as being in a state of drift. This drift can be defined in terms of a cycle where a language changes its basic word order by means of a fixed sequence from SOV to SVO to VSO and so on.
Yeah, so we have SOV here, SVO, and then VSO, and back again.
Right.
So here's the cycle. And what about this? Well, this is now the extra stage which we insert, which some languages use because they have this special topicalization phase, like Middle English, where you have an intermediate phase, the TVX phase, where the topic is either the subject or any other element, and X is the rest. And by an analogical change, you then simply turn T into the subject and X into the object.
Yes, here are also some more examples of impersonal constructions that still occur in modern German. The first one is mich friert es, which is in English me freezes it, and it became ich friere or I freeze in English. And the second example is mich freut es or me likes it in English, and it became ich freue mich, so I like it.
Okay, oh, so these are impersonal constructions in German.
Exactly.
All right. So this is then literal. We have to be careful. This is no standard English, of course.
Not at all. Well, so much for syntax. Let us now look at some lexical changes.
Well, lexical change, that is, change that concerns the vocabulary of a language, is perhaps the most obvious change that you register when you look at linguistic change. And many people are very much fascinated by this type of change. It is profoundly connected with life, culture, sociology, literature, well, everything that has to do with a language community. What would you say are the most obvious types of lexical change?
Well, there are two basic principles which are involved. First of all, the arrival of new words, and second, the loss of already existing lexemes. But these types of changes can be subdivided further into widening, narrowing, shift, and figurative use.
Okay, let's start with widening. Well, widening is if a lexeme acquires additional meanings while still retaining the old one. In Old English we had brid, which meant bird. In fact, it meant young bird, and the general term for bird was voerel, fowl. During the Middle English period, both merged and became fowl of any age. Okay, the next one is narrowing, the opposite of widening. Our example here comes from Old English, where Mete meant food in general. Today we have two terms, we have food and meat, and of course you know that these two words are different today.
Well, another change is the
Okay.
shift. It means that one lexeme completely loses its original meaning and acquires a new meaning. An example is the Middle English word boy, and when it was adapted into Middle English, the Old English form knecht shifted its earlier meaning of boy or male youth to the more narrow meaning of youthful gentleman soldier. And our last example is that of figurative use, which means that the meaning of a lexeme is based on analogy or likeness between things. And an example is the word crane, which has on the one hand the biological sense, and on the other hand it denotes a certain vehicle. Let us summarize.
Okay. Well, having defined the central principles of language change, phonology, morphology in our first part of this two-part e-lecture, and then syntactic and lexical change in this e-lecture, a central question is why? Why do languages change? Well, linguistic change does not operate in an across-the-board fashion. Some speakers introduce the change before others, and the change gradually spreads through a language. With regard to lexical change, this is called lexical diffusion. And this is how language change seems to work. First, only a few people use the change sporadically, in a few words and constructions in their local variety. And then a large number of words and constructions are affected, and eventually the entire language.
To see how these and other reasons for language change interact, we recommend you to view our e-lecture, Reasons for Language Change.
Until then. This e-lecture focuses on the main reasons for language change. It is enormously difficult to be precise about these reasons. Apparently, a number of interacting factors are at work when languages change their structure. These factors can be subdivided into external factors and internal factors. External factors are non-linguistic by nature, and internal factors relate to the organizational principles of natural languages themselves. Let us start with the external factors. Now, one central factor that is listed here has to do with the geographical organization of languages and their varieties. When people move away from each other, their languages or dialects will diverge. New experiences will be made, and at least the vocabularies will change. Well, here is an example from North America. When people want to buy a carbonated drink to quench their thirst, what would they say when they order it? Would they ask for a soda, a pop, a Coke, or something else? Well, quite interestingly, in the South, well, roughly this part here, the generic term Coke is used because that drink is predominantly used. Pop, by contrast, dominates the North and the Northwest. So this is an area where people would order a pop. Well, and in California and in parts of the Northeast, people would prefer the term soda. In the past, people were geographically divided by mountain ranges, rivers, oceans, former kingdoms, etc. Today, however, the increased mobility of people within and between countries makes the geographical factor even more important than ever before. A second factor is referred to as social prestige. Now, people come to talk like those they identify with or who they admire. This process may be conscious or subconscious. A conscious change can be observed in those cases where people want to avoid a certain feature in their spoken or written language. William Labov produced a famous example of such a conscious change. Now here is William Labov, a leading sociolinguist of our time. Now, what he did, he selected 3 storehouses in New York City, and he wanted to find out whether people produce the post-vocalic R in their speech or not. So, do they say something like car, the British variant, or do they prefer car, the today's North American variant? Well, he selected the following storehouses, which are different in terms of prestige. So whereas S. Klein is relatively low in terms of prestige, Saks is ranked relatively high with Macy's in the middle. Now what Labov did was brilliant and simple at the same time. He simply asked people where he could find a certain type of trousers, shirt or whatever, and they had to answer something like, well, on the second, well, what did they say? Floor or floor? Well, he found out that the results were something like this. In the less prestigious storehouses, people would prefer the variant without a post-vocalic R, so they would prefer floor, whereas in the prestigious storehouses, the tendency was to use the post-vocalic R. Hence, it was considered to be prestigious by those who bought their clothes in cheap-priced stores at the time to sound British. Today, this is no longer the case. Subconscious change is less noticeable but more common. Such changes may be towards a favored accent or dialect which has high prestige, or away from what is considered not to be prestigious. For example, look at British English. Here you see a picture of the Queen. Now, in British English, RP, the type of English used by the upper class, has a high prestige scientifically, but a relatively low prestige among ordinary people. Let's move on with the main internal factors. One of these factors is referred to as ease of articulation. Now, in the 19th century, it was widely believed that sounds change because speakers want to minimize their articulatory effort. On this basis, sounds and sound systems would become simpler over long periods of time. In fact, there is evidence in various types of sound changes that this is the case. Here is an example from Old English. In Old English, we had the following verb: driven, which means to drive in present-day English. Now, phonemically, this can be transcribed like this. Driven. Now, what happened? Well, at the first stage, the final alveolar nasal was dropped. The result was drive, and since final or unstressed schwa is often dropped too by means of processes of elision, at a later stage the result was drive. Well, then at further stages of the development of English, of course, the vowel changed. Here the great vowel shift came into action, but that's a different story. In contrast to such obvious cases of the ease of articulation, there are many cases where articulatory complexity is unaffected by a sound change, and there are even cases where the complexity of a sound system has increased. Compare the vocalic systems of Old English, which is relatively simple, with the present-day English sound system of RP, for example, with 20 vowels. So only a small part of language change can be explained by a principle of minimizing the articulatory effort. Other factors must come in. One of such factors is referred to as analogy, which is often discussed together with the principle of reinterpretation. Let's look at analogy and reinterpretation in more detail. Here we have the system of relative pronouns in present-day English. In fact, we have three paradigms. We have the paradigm who, whose, whom, which relates to personal nominals. Then which, whose, which relates to impersonal. So let's write down minus personal. Well, and then we have a pattern, that, whose, that, which can be related to both plus or minus personal. So in relative clauses, like the boy and then relative pronoun I saw, we can use that in each case, the boy that I saw, the house that I saw. If we relate it to just a personal one, we have to say the boy who I saw and the house which I saw. Now, what is happening? Well, in the that, whose, that paradigm, we have identity between the two forms that signal the object and the subject position. This would be the object position, and this would be the subject position. So there's no difference. And the same applies to the paradigm of the minus personal environment. Again, we have no difference between the subject position, which, and the object position, which. However, in this case here, who and whom, we have a difference. And we would have to say the boy whom I saw, because here we have an object relative pronoun, versus the boy who is my friend. which would be the subject position. Now what is happening in present-day English is that by means of an analogical change, these two forms, who versus whom, are also made identical. In other words, the final bilabial nasal is dropped, and this explains why, by analogy, there's a change going on, reducing the complexity in the personal paradigm, where most native speakers of English would now accept the form, the boy who I saw. It should be noted, though, that analogy does not create new patterns. Rather, it extends the patterns that already exist in a language. Closely related to the process of analogy is the mechanism of reinterpretation, a type of change that primarily applies to changes in syntax. In Middle English, for example, we had the so-called impersonal constructions where there was no overt subject. So a form like me dremit with the topic me didn't involve a subject that in terms of pronouns is normally marked in the nominative case. But me is certainly not a nominative marked pronoun. So there was no subject. However, since the majority of the cases in English involves true subjects, which are either not case marked at all in the case of standard nouns, but can be case marked in terms of some pronouns, I, he, we, and they, for example. Now, by analogy with this majority of cases, this construction was reinterpreted, where me dreamit became I dreamed, and now we have a true subject which is marked in the nominative case. So a principle of reinterpretation in syntax. Finally, language change may be the effect of language contact. It is well known that when languages come into contact, they tend to borrow from one another. The most obvious form is the borrowing of lexical items. The history of English is full of examples of such kind. For example, after the Norman Conquest, during the early period of Middle English, numerous words from several lexical fields entered the English language, fields such as law or government. Here you see just some of the terms that entered the English language during the early days of Middle English. In summary then, language change is due to an interplay of several factors, external and internal ones.